The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Billions in pandemic relief spending flew out the door in an unprecedented governmental effort to protect people from the economic ravages of COVID-19. Ontario's Auditor General says mistakes were made. Tonight, we'll examine the Ontario government's record on that. Then, 80 years ago this month, in the early going of World War II, Canadian soldiers fought in and lost the Battle of Hong Kong. We'll learn about their shockingly difficult fate from the son of one of those who survived. It's Monday, December 13th, and that's all next on the agenda. A recent report from Ontario's Auditor General laid out some stark facts about pandemic-era relief spending. For example, in the mad scramble to keep the economy from crashing completely, the AG found that Ontario paid almost $1 billion in COVID-19 relief to ineligible businesses. With us now for a closer look, and as is our custom here, we'll introduce our guests from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in the nation's capital. In the Glebe, there's Ian Lee, Associate Professor at Carleton University's Sprott School of Business. And in the provincial capital, in the East End, Mitch Davidson, Executive Director of Strategy Corp's Institute of Public Policy. He's formerly Executive Director of Policy for Premier Doug Ford. At Young and Bloor, NDP advisor Kim Wright, who's principal at Wright Strategies. And just a few subway stops closer at Summerhill, Deb Matthews, former Deputy Premier and Liberal Cabinet Minister, and it's great to have all of you on TVO tonight. Let's just, before we get into our discussion here, take a look at some of the highlights of what the Auditor General found as it related to the distribution of pandemic relief spending. For example, Sheldon, bring up this graphic if you would. Relief programs for businesses cost $11.2 billion, about a third of the money that was set aside for provincial COVID-19 relief. Here are the details now. More than $210 million from the Ontario Small Business Support Grant was given to 14,500 ineligible recipients. And the government apparently didn't make any attempts to recover this money. The money many businesses received was more than their reported revenue loss, meaning they actually made money off the program. Some businesses that got funding may not even have been based in Ontario. A CEO of a company that got a $2.5 million contract was actually part of the province's vaccine task force. At least $16 million in energy rebates and property tax were handed over to more than 3,000 ineligible businesses. And ministries relied heavily on self-reported information. There was no centralized tracking of where the money went or whether or not it was effective. Now let's get the quote of the AG on the record here. As a consequence, she said, of speeding up the delivery of programs once a funding decision was made, eligibility controls were either missing entirely, poorly designed, or not applied. Let's figure this out. Mitch, you want to get us started? How does something like this happen?
Sure. I mean, the reality is that the government was in the middle of a crisis and it needed to get this money out the door as quickly as possible. So a traditional program that you would use to give money back to people, like, say, a tax credit, businesses would have had to wait till the end of the year, and that might have been closing their doors permanently. So the government chose a faster method, which had less controls in place. And yes, some overpayments were made, and that's an unfortunate consequence, but it's much better than the reality of letting businesses fail because we were too slow to get money out the door. So I think we've identified that government is pretty good at taking money out of people's pockets, and it might not be that good at putting it back into people's pockets.
Ian, when you first heard what the government's plans were, did you sort of calculate that, well, we have to expect this after all, we're doing it quickly, we're trying to help people, that's the way it goes?
I certainly predicted it because it was inevitable when any government says, look, it's an emergency, we have to get the money out the door quickly. I mean, I interpret that as almost a code talk for saying we are going to suspend due diligence. We're going to suspend the checks and balances that normally apply for, old age pension or unemployment insurance or that sort of thing. And so inevitably, once you make that decision to suspend those due diligence checks, there's going to be money that is issued that should not have been issued, and there won't be the controls in place to catch it or detect it.
Kim, given the nature of the emergency, and we have to remember it really was very dire, Was it necessary for the government to, as Ian suggests, suspend the normal due diligence it does before shoveling money out the door?
It was necessary to get the money out the door. I'm not certain that the oversight was there at all, even contemplated. But there was other things that the AG talked about in terms of lack of consultation of the people who were going to get the money, who needed the money from certain industries that were frankly left out of the cold. So this was a rush job because the provincial government had spent so much time finger pointing at the feds, hoping that they would do it. And the feds were finger pointing at the province, hoping they would do it. And at the end of it all, too many people, families, individuals, businesses kept getting left out in the cold. Were there some challenges of oversight? Sure. But there was also just problems with how the program was set up in the first place. And that needs to be looked at going forward because this isn't going anywhere anytime soon.
Deb Matthews, just before I get you to comment, apparently one of your Liberal Eastern Ontario MPPs, Amanda Simard, is a big fan of Oprah. Because her comment was, the PC government is a terrible version of Oprah with taxpayers' money is the way she put it. She said, you get a grant, you get a grant. Outside of Ontario, you get a grant. You're not eligible? Whatever, you get a grant anyway. Everybody gets a grant. Okay, that's pretty funny, but is that really a fair characterization of what went on here?
Well, Steve, when as I read the AG report, half of the money that went to ineligible companies, half the money. There's something very seriously wrong. And, there are a whole bunch of things to talk about here. I'm sure we'll get to them all, but let's just focus on the timeline for a minute. On December 17th, then Minister Rod Phillips, gave instructions to the ministry on setting up the criteria. 2 days later, the 19th of December, it was submitted to Treasury Board, and 2 days later, December 21st, it was announced. That is so ridiculously speedy. And then when you think about the timeline of the finance minister being on his vacation in St. Bart's, he was away when this was happening. So I think there are some serious questions about competence and about rushing it out the door. When you send money to companies that don't operate in Ontario, when, as I say, half the money goes to ineligible companies, and then you make the decision that you're not going to try to collect, you're just going to write it off.
Well, hold off on that. We're going to come back to whether they should have gone to get it. But I want to ask you a follow-up because I think you were president of the Treasury Board once upon a time in this province.
Yes,
So you just put a timeline forward that basically says between idea and out the door, it's 4 days.
4 days.
In your judgment, based on your experience, I guess a two-part question. How long should that take if everybody's doing due diligence? And do you have any sympathy for the speed with which they had to make decisions here, given the nature of the emergency?
They had to make decisions. They had to make them quickly, but they took everything at face value. They had no criteria. It was a very poor job with an absent minister.
Mitch, a poor job with an absent minister. Fair characterization?
No, I don't really think so. I think Ontarians needed that relief, and they needed it quickly. I mean, I think the former minister will recall when she was in office, there was an ice storm in 2013, 2014, and the government chose to give relief money back in the form of gift cards, and those went to people who were not eligible as well. The reality is that you have to put yourself in the shoes of the business owner. If you are facing a real risk to your livelihood, a chance that your business may not survive, you apply for the program. And if the government made a wrong decision on eligibility, which the auditor pointed out many other businesses should have been eligible, then this is a way to fix that eligibility, is to continue to hand out the money to those businesses, even if they don't meet the parameters of the program. So I would think of it more as, yes, it was a quick job to get it out the door. They just made those other policy changes while the program was operational, rather than waiting to get them right before the program started, because he needed to get that money into people's pockets immediately.
Your predecessors didn't do $1 billion in gift cards, though. This is big dollars. Does that matter?
Yeah, but I would just say, I mean, I've heard some comparisons about $1 billion in gas plants. To me, the idea is that the scandal on the previous government was giving money to insiders and friends, and the scandal on the Conservative government is giving money back to taxpayers. We're really talking about a government giving too much money back to its own businesses in the time of crisis. I think if you asked the Premier, Premier Ford, that this program was going to cost $1 billion more than he thought, but it would keep businesses afloat, he would have said, great, let's put an extra $1 billion in the program, because that's what we really needed to do, was make sure that those businesses were going to be able to survive the pandemic.
Well, Ian, let's look at the setup for this. Obviously, the government said the emergency is such that we're not going to be able to do the due diligence we normally do. We're going to have to rely kind of on the honor system here. Was there any other way to set this up?
Yes, there was. About 20 years ago in our country, it's not the royal we, our elected officials properly from all the political parties made a very major decision to go towards e-government. In plain English, all government is now digitized, including, most importantly, the tax collection system. Again, in even more plain English, that means everybody files a return. 31 million people filed returns last year. They're in the database, and over 2 million corporations are required by law, both profit and nonprofit must file. What that means is that the database holds awesome information on every variable that's on the tax returns, where you live, your bank account, and so forth. So to get quickly to the point, any government could have pushed the money out the door far more quickly, actually, than what was done by simply going, the cabinet minister or the premier or the prime minister going to the minister responsible for revenue and saying, tell your public servants to reverse the pipeline. And I call the pipeline, the tax normally flows in from business and consumers to the government. When you reverse the pipeline, think HST rebates and carbon tax rebates, the revenue department, CRA, credits the bank account of the designated group that the ministers have decided upon, everybody below $60,000, or every business with revenues below $100,000. I mean, fill in the blank. The beauty of a digital database is you can filter, slice, and dice the data 18,000 ways to Sunday.
Right. Okay, we get you.
They could have done it that way in a much more targeted manner.
Let me find out from Kim. Kim, you run a business. Do you think it could have been done that way?
It absolutely could have. And, Deb talked about the 4 days between conception to, application phase. It didn't have to be this way. I mean, we were dealing with the pandemic since March. We were looking at the restrictions and the furthering of restrictions for months beforehand. They knew that businesses were struggling. They decided not to do this. And this is what happens when you have a government that has much disdain for government. They don't want to do the programs. They don't look at these things as a wholesale. How do you actually help people? How do you actually put the proper metrics in place? How do you put the things in place that you need? Steve, we only need to look at schools. They've known for years, decades, in fact, that the ventilation systems in schools and in long-term care facilities were terrifyingly bad. They could have done RFPs a year in the early stage of the pandemic in the summer. They waited an extra year. It's the same thing of this. They want credit and the gold star for, we tried to help businesses. But at the end of the day, they weren't doing anything to help people all the way through. They were just sort of ham-fisting it, hoping no one would notice the finance minister was in St. Bart's.
Mitch, any idea why they didn't choose to do it the way that Ian and Kim have just described?
Well, I would just say simply it's worth pointing out that Ontario doesn't control its own tax system. It's got an agreement with the Canada Revenue Agency, and so the federal government would be one that would be rebating programs through the tax system, and normally they wait till year end. You'll notice that the federal government themselves, when they were designing support programs, most notably CERB for people, they did not do it through the tax system. They did it as an application-based system as well. So clearly, both the federal government and the provincial government understood that the speed was faster if they did it through an application-based program rather than if they did it through the tax system, and that's really what we're talking about here.
All right, Deb, let me circle back then to the second point you were trying to make when I interrupted you, which is, having got the money out the door and having realized that a lot of it went to people who shouldn't have got it, what potential processes does the government then have to get the money back? Do they have any?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely they do. Probably Ian could speak more on the technicalities of how they would do that. But you can't just put money out the door and and not even try to collect it, write it off for what appeared to me to be political reasons. They didn't want to disturb people during COVID with having to pay back money they shouldn't have gotten in the first place. So, I mean, I've got a problem with that. And you layer that on top of the $1 billion they wrote off on the 407. And then you layer on top of that $6 billion. It'll be way more than that if it ever gets built on the 413. This is money that could go to so many other things. I think, we're all thinking about rapid testing right now. We're all thinking about how are we going to have a Christmas with the people we love, please, safely. This money could have gone into rapid testing for people, given us a lot more peace of mind, and caught earlier positive cases of COVID. So, there's a lot of places that money could have been spent, and it breaks my heart, actually, because I can imagine the difference it would make if it was put in the right places.
Well, okay, they could have done it, but Kim, follow up on that if you would. It's one thing to be able to do something. It's another thing to decide to do it. Is it politically advisable for the government at this stage to go to the thousands of businesses that shouldn't have got this money but did and say, we want some of that back?
Well, I think they're going to have to look at this, and people will find their political pound of flesh wherever they can out of this. But at the end of the day, we want to make sure that for the next emergency, that there is better oversight of any of these programs, because there are going to be additional measures. We've started to hear rumblings about these types of things. Businesses are continuing to suffer. Certainly, property taxes will still need to be paid, and municipalities will still need to be made whole for some of the public health spending that's out there. But there are lots of things that this government should be focusing on. They've been sitting on millions of rapid tests. They could have been giving those out to school children well before now. They could have been doing a number of public health measures. And Steve, you'll remember, and I talk about this only because right before the pandemic, the Ford government was actually trying to cut public health units across the province. So again, governing is choosing, and show me your budget, I'll tell you your priorities. And their priorities were not helping people get back to work. They could have also instituted paid sick leave, not just, we'll guarantee your job. That doesn't help someone pay the rent. And we need to make sure that when you're looking at government policies, how are you helping people? How are you moving forward? And how are you doing your job to keep society going? And what we see with this auditor's report is on every measure that these things had failed, and there were too many people who weren't looking at what was best for Ontarians, but rather what was best for politics.
Well, okay, let me stay with that. Mitch, this is admittedly a more political as opposed to economic question, but here we are 6 months before the next provincial election. There are lots of small businesses in this province who already feel pretty hard done by some of the decisions that the current government of Ontario made. If you were advising the Premier right now, do you think it's politically advisable to go after the thousands of businesses that got money that shouldn't have and tell them to pay it back?
Yeah, I think there's a distinction here. And I think the Premier was right that he'd go after the businesses where it was fraudulent, those who may not have actually had an operational business or who weren't in the province of Ontario. But the money that went to ineligible businesses that still needed relief, even the auditor said that they should have been included in the program, I don't think it is advisable to go after those businesses. The reality is that the pandemic is still ongoing. And so, this support money, I would think of it more as a life raft, but we shouldn't fool ourselves that these businesses have made it to shore and to safety yet. There's still a long way to go. Even Dan Kelly, the head of the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses, said we've seen a lot of small business deaths. We just haven't had the funerals yet. And I think we're still in a very trepidatious time for these business owners. So going and saying, hey, well, you're struggling and there's potential for more restrictions coming and there's all these capacity issues that you have, give us back $10,000, $20,000. I don't think that's a smart move politically, and I don't think it's a smart move economically as well.
Ian, let me follow up with you on that because okay, let's put it this way. I know it's always easier to blame politicians whenever anything goes wrong. But the fact of the matter is, I don't know that every single one of the businesses that applied for this money did so fraudulently. A lot of them may have done it by error. They just didn't know if they were eligible or not, so they thought, what the heck, we'll try it. But at the end of the day, how much responsibility do the people who applied for these programs need to take themselves for the fact that they got money that they shouldn't have?
Complete responsibility. Steve, many, many years ago, back in the 70s, early 80s, I was a banker. I lent money. And if we put money in and from time to time mistakes are made and a customer was credited money that was a mistake on the bank's part, and they had a legal, this has been tested in the courts and determined, they had a legal responsibility and a legal liability to repay the money to which they were not entitled. And so if the government doesn't go after it, I think it's encouraging moral hazard. In the next pandemic or the next crisis, people say, hey, look, they don't go after us if we file claims that are not completely legit. And then secondly, to answer your question, individuals are not entitled at law to money. They're not entitled to keep money that they weren't entitled to in the first place.
Okay, so you're saying that 6 months before an election, the province of Ontario ought to go out and try and get that money back?
Well, that I'm not addressing the political question, Steve. I'm talking about the pragmatic question. I think most Canadians understand that, if they were given money by mistake because it was credited to their bank account, for example, then they are not entitled to keep it and they must repay it. And that's really the principle I'm invoking. It's not only a legal principle, but it's a common sense understanding, I think, that you're not entitled to keep what was not due to you in the first place.
Understood. Okay, we have been talking about the Auditor General, who's an independent actor in the Ontario legislative system, and I want to just shift focus briefly now to another independent actor, an independent agent in the Ontario political system, and that's the Financial Accountability Officer, because he too has been looking at some of the numbers associated with all of this, and he found that in the first quarter of this year, the Ontario government had not distributed any of the $2.7 billion that they had earmarked to fight COVID-19. And in last month's mini budget, this is the fall economic statement that came out not that long ago, it was revealed that they spent $3.5 billion less than planned on health care. Now, Mitch, start us off here. Why does the government appear to be, on the one hand, shoveling money out to people who are not eligible for it, and on the other hand, not spending money that they have already budgeted to take care of other important problems?
Yeah, I actually think it's a fairly simple answer. You budget in a crisis for the worst case scenario, right? You put aside as much money as you could possibly need if things are going to go very poorly. And every time that things are better than expected, you don't have to spend that money. So every time that an Ontarian does not get the virus, does not have to go to a testing facility, does not have to end up in an ICU bed, does not have to be, transported by air ambulance to a hospital with extra capacity, that not only is good for that individual, that's good for the economy, but it also saves the government money because they don't have to spend on those things. So it's actually a good thing that we're spending less than we had put aside for COVID, because that means that there is less COVID in Ontario today than was anticipated. Ideally, everybody on this panel should agree that we want to get to a place where we have to put $0 aside for COVID. That's the future that we're working to. And just so in this scenario, we are spending less than budgeted because we've had less transmission of the virus than the worst case scenarios have projected. And that is actually a good thing.
I got to do a follow-up with you on that, though, Mitch, because the Financial Accountability Officer also pointed out that there are probably, because of the pivot required in the healthcare system, there are probably $1.3 billion worth of diagnostic tests that did not happen because the healthcare system said, we haven't got time to do those right now. We got to focus on COVID. If you've got $3.5 billion set aside, contingent on, and you haven't spent it, and there's $1.3 billion of tests, diagnostic breast cancer tests, elective surgeries that have not been done, have you got a problem here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue here is now about capacity, right? And so I wish that we could, walk and chew gum at the same time when it came to healthcare professionals being able to do all these things. But hospitals are prioritizing their internal decision making, and they're focusing on things. There's not a single hospital in Ontario that didn't ask for more money and then not receive it, right? So those hospitals are making those operational decisions that they have to make in order to make sure that they can process COVID cases. I wish that we were at a place where we could do both, and I think hopefully the government can get there. But the reality is that's a capacity issue with the amount of healthcare professionals we have in this province, which is another debate, which we can blame some of that on government. We can blame some of that elsewhere. But I think when you're talking about the finances, the Premier has said that he's not going to spare a single penny. And frankly, he's actually been putting that money out the door, even if it's not as much as he budgeted in a rainy day situation.
Deb Matthews, let me get your view on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really disturbing comment, Mitch. There's real need in the healthcare system. Patients are going waiting. We just look at rapid tests, right? There are lots of ways you can put more money into the system to have better outcomes, fewer cases of COVID, and to just say, oh, we don't have enough people in the system. That's just not, that is very upsetting, actually, to hear that. This is a government that I don't think has fully grasped how serious COVID is. I think, when Sylvia Jones said, oh, we're not going to do anything now because we have to wait to see if the modeling comes true. And then that kind of epitomizes, for me, the attitude of this government. It's been grossly incompetent. It has had its priorities wrong. And to leave over $3 billion in dedicated healthcare spending that mostly came from the federal government, let's not forget, unspent is, I think, is a tragedy.
You referenced Sylvia Jones, the Solicitor General of the current government. Kim, what's your view on the unspent money, budgeted but not spent?
Well, the interesting thing, Steve, is if you look back to the SARS report, that was pretty detailed in how best to deal with these type of pandemics going forward. One of the things they talked about was having a dedicated hospital for SARS-like patients, and then making sure other hospitals were operationalized. They could have done that in this case with COVID, looking at where were the needs, where could we have brought things in. Could we have the medical camps type of thing to make sure that all of the other patients, the heart patients, cardiac patients, the cancer patients, were still being triaged and given those diagnostic capabilities? That didn't happen, let alone what could have been done if we had actually had rapid testing or paid sick leave. I look at the family that was in Brampton, the father who was trying his best to keep his family going, and then he and his young daughter die of COVID. Come on, don't tell me that you were managing the pandemic, Steve, and we were underspending in healthcare. The entirety of how we were doing things is actually healthcare. Then when we look at, other things that have been underspent on under the COVID cover, as I want to call it, look over here, let's talk about COVID, as opposed to the autism funding program that has been woefully underfunded, woefully rolled out. There are about 600 families that are going through, when there's about 50,000 that should be eligible. There are so many things that this government has not spent the money on. Let's talk about long-term care. Let's talk about people who are on ODSP at Ontario Works and how they are not being held up to a good quality standard of funding. Those are things that should be priorities for a government in Ontario that is worried about public health. And how do we maintain the healthcare system? And how do we maintain Ontarians' quality of life? But to say we're underfunding this by a few billion and a few million here and there so they can look better on their books, that to me is abhorrent.
Well, let me ask Ian about that, because, the fact is, during the fall economic statement, the deficit of the province of Ontario was a lot smaller than had been anticipated a year earlier. Is there an argument to be made that if you've got money budgeted for something and you, in your judgment, feel you don't need to spend it on that, put it towards deficit reduction and keep that deficit number as low as possible?
I'm sure Steve, this has been debated literally going back to the emergence of democracy in the Middle Ages in England, and that's the whole question of the authority of Parliament. And I won't get into that historical debate. I actually, if I can answer it in a slightly different way, because this is my one of my favorite subjects that I like to research, I think this whole issue shows the absolute crucial importance of watchdogs. And I'm referring to the Parliamentary Budget Office federally, the Auditor General federally, and provincially, and the FAO, because this isn't a criticism of the opposition members of Parliament, MPPs, but government has become so large and so complex that we need the extraordinary professionalism, objectivity, nonpartisanship of an organization like the FAO or the Auditor General to ferret out these issues in the first place so that we can talk about it on your program and hopefully develop solutions going forward. And I hope the FAO does come up with solutions to create a roadmap for the future so that this won't happen again, maybe using, as I said, essentially a de facto negative income tax or setting up other mechanisms to ensure that unspent funds are properly accounted for and recorded and can be turned back to the legislature for debate over reallocation, that sort of thing. But we need really good data, and that's coming from the watchdog agencies.
All right, that takes us back to Mitch. And Mitch, let me get you to comment on this aspect of the story. I guess the conservative brand, as it likes to portray itself, is we're kind of tight on spending. We don't believe in profligate spending. And the requirements of this COVID-19 pandemic have required us to make some decisions that are very off-brand for conservatives. Do you think that has been part of what has made it difficult for this group of decision makers to do their thing?
For sure. I mean, I don't think anyone had, Doug Ford runs province's largest deficit on their bingo card for this mandate, right, before the pandemic started. And the reality is that in times of crisis, that money needed to go out the door, and the Premier's done that. We should keep in mind that although not as much as was budgeted was spent, it's still the largest amount of money that's ever been spent on healthcare in the province's history. It's still a $16 billion deficit. It's still an excessive amount of money that was put aside and that was spent to make sure that people were protected. And we also have to remember, I think it's an important contextual point, because hindsight is 2020. When they put those projections in the latest budget, they did that in February and March. And that was when we were in the midst of arguably the worst point of the pandemic in Ontario. So projecting out that it was going to be very bad for a while was something that they did. And then it turns out that we actually got the vaccination rollout that we needed, and that case spread and positivity rate came down, and here we are with less financial need to accommodate those things. So I do agree with the majority of the panel about the importance of the watchdogs. I do agree that the government needed to spend money to make sure that it was protecting the lives of citizens. I just don't think it's as cut and dry as saying, did you spend exactly what you put aside, yes or no, and therefore you did everything you can.
All right, but Deb Matthews, could you follow up on that by answering this question? Have lessons been learned, and will they be applied in the future?
Oh, I hope so. Who knows whether they'll be applied in the future? That's the sad reality. But I think you've got to shine the light on this kind of thing, and you've got to hold the government responsible. I mean, a lot goes on within the ministries that you don't have a lot of political control over, but there were some political decisions made here, some very irresponsible, incompetent activities by this government, and they have to be held account. We can't, we can't just let it slide. And there was a company that got $10,000. It had a reported loss of 2 cents. And if you're going to tell me that company lost 2 cents and they get to keep the $10,000 that they should never have received in the first place, I've got a problem with that. And it's a political decision. You asked earlier about the politics of going after companies this close to an election. I tell you, if people knew what was going on, if they knew the businesses had received far more than they had lost, I think the politics is clear. You gotta put that money where it belongs. Get it back to government and put it into those things that need attention.
Ian, I'm down to my last minute and change here, and I guess I want to know, you've looked at numerous governments over the years. How confident are you that this government has learned lessons from what's transpired over the last year and change and will do something about it going forward?
I'm going to give you a sort of quasi-political answer, even though that's not my domain. I think the more serious the criticism that Ms. Matthews was referencing, the more public the condemnation, then and that comes back to the watchdogs. The more because of the late Justice Brandeis' famous phrase that sunshine is the most powerful disinfectant of all. And so the more that these kinds of scandals are exposed, then I think governments are going to be more willing to learn the lessons and apply the lessons to ensure that they don't happen again.
Gotcha. That's the last word on this discussion. I want to thank all of you for coming onto our program tonight. Ian Lee from Carleton University's Sprott School of Business. Mitch Davidson, Executive Director of Strategy Corp's Institute of Public Policy. He used to work in Premier Ford's office. Kim Wright, the NDP strategist and the principal at Wright Strategies. And Deb Matthews, former president of the Treasury Board, former health minister, former minister of advanced education, former what the heck else did she do? She was the minister of everything back in the day. Thank all four of you for coming onto our program tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, no.
On December 8, 1941, Japan invaded Hong Kong. In less than 3 weeks, the British garrison there, which had been fortified with Canadian troops, was overrun. That fight and the fate of those soldiers as prisoners of war is the subject of a harrowing new book written by the son of a Canadian Forces doctor who lived through it all. It's called The Captain Was a Doctor, The Long War and Uneasy Peace of POW John Reed. And it brings Jonathan Reed to our virtual studio tonight from Riverdale in the provincial capital. And Jonathan, we're so grateful you could spare some time for us tonight. How are you doing?
Very well, thank you, Steve, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for saying so. I do want to start by having you take us back to August of 1941, a little over 80 years ago, and your dad is a young Canadian doctor. He volunteers to join the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. There's his picture. Boy, what a good-looking guy he was. How did he end up being sent to Hong Kong?
At the end of their 5 weeks officer training, the men were offered a chance to take a 2-week tropical medicine course. And my father, of course, was curious. He and a friend, Gordon Gray, opted to do that. And in the meantime, as they were going through that course, in the background were the negotiations between Britain and Canada to send battalions to Hong Kong as reinforcements. And when it came time to choose 2 extra medical men to go with the battalions, the powers that be thought that those men that had just finished a tropical medicine course, and as they were going to semi-tropical Hong Kong, were the ones to pick. So it was Gordon Gray and John Reed.
We have a picture of his unit's arrival in Hong Kong. Sheldon, you want to bring that up and we'll take a look? He arrived just, there it is, 3 weeks before the fateful battle. That is his unit arriving in Hong Kong. Do you think these Canadians understood that they were essentially being sent to a suicide mission?
The vast majority would not have known that. There were a few signs that officers who'd taken the course earlier had been told that Hong Kong was an outpost and would remain an outpost. And the definition of that in military parlance from the British point of view was it was a position that was to be defended, but could not be reinforced, and the men could not be extracted from it. So it was fight to the finish. But the majority did not know that, and they had been led to believe they were going on garrison duty, and they were led to believe that the intelligence reports showed that there was no imminent danger from the Japanese, and that the Japanese forces to the north of Hong Kong were actually quite weak.
Well, that turned out to be clearly untrue. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and overrun. And let's set up this next question by just situating the event. December 8, 1941, it's the day after Pearl Harbor. I guess a hardened Japanese force that had already been fighting the Chinese for 10 years. They attacked the Canadians, and this group had never seen battle before. One Canadian described it as a cauldron of hell. Perhaps you could help us better understand what they were facing at that moment.
Well, to begin with, it was actually simultaneous with the attack on Pearl Harbor because they were across the date line.
Oh, of course.
The forces were arrayed on the mainland to the north of Hong Kong Island, and the rest were on the island. The initial attack by the overwhelming Japanese force, instead of taking a week to beat their way south to the Hong Kong Island, took about 40 hours. In other words, it was a collapse on the part of the garrison. They were quickly withdrawn onto the island, and starting on December 13th, there was a continual siege of bombardment, artillery, airplane bombing of the island to soften it up. And on December 19th, huge forces attacked across the water to the north shore of the island. What had been seen by the Canadians on arrival was that there really hadn't been preparation for this kind of an assault. There should have been positions on the mountains, which there weren't. And the way Hong Kong Island is topographically laid out, it's full of mountains and canyons, so that there are only certain ways you can make your way forward or backward. The numbers that the Canadians had along with the others, with about 14,000. And there were well over 40,000, perhaps 50,000 Japanese coming against them. The battle in this very ferocious, scrub-like, mountainous canyons, valleys, hot temperatures. And the thing to remember was that the Canadians had been sent across the Pacific without their third ship, which had 212 vehicles, their armored carriers, their water carriers, their trucks. They lacked mortar ammunition that should have gone with them. So they arrived with a bare cupboard as far as their backup, and they had to borrow things. So the Canadians, in spite of the fact that they were shortchanged in respect to the material they had with them, in the battle, though General Maltby had belittled their training and their capability, the reports showed after the war that the Japanese found the Canadians the toughest to fight, and they had the highest casualties against the Canadians, in spite of the fact that they lacked some of the needs that were left behind.
And do I have this right? Is this the first time in World War II that Canadians would have fought on the ground in battle?
That's correct. The Canadians, the two regiments that went, the Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, were the first to fight. And as it turned out, they would be the last troops to come home in 1945.
Let's do an excerpt from the book here because, well, the Canadians eventually surrendered. Many became prisoners of war, including your father, and here is what it was like inside the camp hospital. Those who couldn't control their body functions had to use the floor. Cakes of excrement and pools of urine lay everywhere. The filth proved a mecca for rats, which were scampering about in large numbers. The next day, the downpour had gotten heavier and never let up. The roof began to leak like a sieve, causing flooding to the depth of 6 to 8 inches. Bricks were brought in to elevate the cots. The rodents, which were swimming around the floating muck, tried to clamber on our beds. Some succeeded and began attacking the flesh of patients, but they didn't feel it. The flesh was dead. Now let's follow up on that with some pictures taken inside one of the, there's one of them right there. This is inside one of the camp huts. And then I'm going to ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up the next picture. This was the effect of the living conditions that the Canadian prisoners had to endure. And, well, Jonathan, I'll simply ask you, when you see that image, I mean, describe the conditions for us that would have led to that.
The excerpt you just read was the makeshift hospital in North Point Camp, which was the first camp the Canadians were sent to in Hong Kong. It was terribly grim. Over the next year, the Canadians were moved to a bigger camp, Sham Shui Po, on the mainland, and the shot you just showed was one of the huts there. And my father said that in their case, if there was a question of a machine or a man, they would say, the man goes, we keep the machine. And obviously we saw the opposite point of view. Over that first year, the caloric intake for the men was probably around 1,000 calories a day. It was a bland food. There was no protein, animal fat, no vitamins consistently. So there was a downgrading, a steady course downgrading of their health. And at the same time, they were suddenly forced with being slave laborers. In Hong Kong, it was to create or to extend an airport, the airport that had been the British airport. So they were used really as almost animals, and it was wearing and tearing. And by the end of the first year, the health of all the men who had lost a quarter to a third of their weight, they all had sores, they all had diarrhea, malaria. Very was rampant with the men. So no one was well. And the Japanese would say, we have to have a certain number of workers per day. And my father and the other medical officers would literally have to decide as they went down the ranks who was not as bad as the others and would have to go out to work. And that first year in August 1942, on top of the diseases they were already struggling with, was an outbreak of diphtheria. And this was a very virulent attack on the Canadians because, though there was a vaccine by this time, many of the troops from eastern Quebec and the prairies had not been vaccinated as young people and therefore were susceptible. And over the next few months, 58 Canadians died of diphtheria. And the reason for this was that the Japanese refused to give antitoxin until the very end. So that this was a loss of life that was unnecessary, and the men had no medicines to fight it.
Ultimately, what was the survival rate among the prisoners of war?
Well, that's a good question. Overall, the Canadians in prison camp in Japan, I can be specific about this, 1,185 Canadians were shipped eventually from Hong Kong to Japan to work as slave laborers there. The overall death rate in the Canadian camps in Japan was 16%. In my father's camp, because of the relationships he formed and the protection he was able to give his men by these negotiations was much lower. It was about 4.6%.
Well, let me follow up on that, because I think your dad, when he did get transferred to Japan, was the only officer among the POWs who were in that camp in Japan. What did that mean? And I guess there were, what, maybe 500 in the camp in total. What did that mean in terms of his responsibilities?
Well, he was chosen as the only officer, and they wanted a medical officer. He later said that that was the best choice, both for the men and for the Japanese. He'd had 5 weeks officers training, so he was not a line officer. He had that year in Hong Kong working with his 3 other doctor colleagues under Dr. John Crawford, who was the senior medical officer. I think he'd learned a lot about handling men and handling the Japanese. But still, he was in charge of 500 men. He found himself now in a brand new camp. These men were being sent to the Nippon Koken shipyard, and they were put to work in terrible drudge jobs, working 12 hours a day, 13 days out of 14. He was, I think, aware after some time that the commandant of the camp that they found themselves in was a man that he could start to push in a direction that would help his own men. And it was a process that took months, but he took a position of sort of calm, persistent persuasion, I think trying to appeal to the humane side and to the commonsensical side, the logical side of the commandant. In other words, saying, you want these men to work. For them to be able to work, they have to be reasonably healthy. They need reasonable food, reasonable rest. And even though they were not able to get anything like the food they should have had, he battled to keep as many men back from work on a daily basis as he could. And that was probably the safest way he could protect the men at that point.
Well, here's a quote from one of his fellow prisoners who said he was a medical practitioner who had no medicines, nothing to work with except his own hands, and yet he's treating 100 people a day. How in heaven's name did he do that?
Well, I think it's the magic of a personality and a physician with a patient. One of the men who was with him, Robert Warren, said exactly what you said, really, that he had no medicines. He knew his men were sick. But Warren said, Dr. Reed, Captain Reed, had a way with him. Those were his words. He had a way with him. And even if he had no medicines to give you, you somehow felt you were being treated.
August of 45, of course, there are 2 atomic bombs dropped on Japan, and after 3.5 years of imprisonment, the war ends for these prisoners of war, and here is how one of your dad's fellow prisoners described it. Sheldon, if you would, the graphic. It was a fighter, and as it circled high above our camp, we all ran into the compound. 600 men went wild. We could plainly make out the red, white, and blue and the white American star. Overcome with joy, naked figures dressed only in G-strings jumped and sprang around. Men slapped each other, shook hands, and cried. It was true. It was really over. They were God's own angels sent to liberate his people. They meant freedom and happiness. It was a beautiful day, the best day of my life. I was overwhelmed by the sudden release of emotions that had been suppressed for 4 long years. I returned to my hut and cried like a baby without any shame. Others were so hysterical they had to be hospitalized, while others sat motionless, too dazed with happiness to be able to speak. I know at some point you no doubt have wondered what your own father thought in that moment. What have you come up with?
I do have documents, writings of his afterwards. His main concern was not for the men to go hog wild. They suddenly had freedom. They could go out the gates. They were given money by the Japanese. They were given increased food. His real concern was that there had been rumors that there could be executions, mass executions. There was uncertainty about a nearby military base and what they would do and what the civilians would do because of the bombing that had taken place. I think he was still very much in leadership mode, not celebrating, thinking, okay, what dangers are we still facing and how do we get through this time? And that's what he spent his time doing, persuading the men to take it easy. Sure, have a good time, but don't overdo it. Don't push things, and let's not upset the people around us, and do the best we can to keep a lid on it until the Americans can get to us.
A couple of months later, October 6, 1945, which I gather is 4 years to the day that your father was shipped out, he arrives back in Toronto, comes home to his wife, Jean, but you write he had become a mentally disturbed man. Not surprisingly, this war changed him. How?
That's a really difficult question, Steve. Everyone that had that experience had some effect that was scarring physically and mentally. I don't think my father realized he was changed immediately. He'd actually written in a letter to my mother from prison camp, "Stay as unchanged for me as I do for you." Well, that was an impossibility. He did re-engage in his medical practice in Toronto. They had 2 children, myself and my older brother, Tony, but he was restless. That was something everyone noticed, his family and his friends. And he'd done a residency in Vancouver just before the war. He decided, because he was invited back to Vancouver to join the clinic, that he was going to do that. And one of his close friends said that Jack said, "I need a fresh start." And off he went. The complication then, that was a good idea perhaps, the complication was that in the short time he was in Vancouver before his wife and children arrived, was that he met another woman, a younger woman, a nurse. And in whatever state emotionally and mentally he was at that stage, this was a coup de foudre. This was a sudden blossoming of great passion. And something he didn't seem to be able to stop. And when my mother arrived with her sons, this complicated life began. My father's persuasive charms, which had worked so well, dealing with the commandant, for instance, in the prison camp, somehow turned and were played on my mother and the other woman, so that over about 6 years, my father eventually was running 2 households. He had 2 families in 2 different places in the same city. And he got through this because he was saying to my mother, "I am mentally ill, I want you to stick by me." And yet he couldn't seem to break the other relationship. And he finally was unable to make a decision. It was my mother's decision 6 years later that she couldn't, in spite of all of her love for him and her wish to help him, stick it any longer. And she was the one who withdrew and came back to Toronto.
Let's bring up a picture of your dad and your brother and you. And, you know, so many guys came home from the war and either told their kids whatever their kids asked about or told them nothing because they just really couldn't talk about it. Where was your dad on that continuum?
The second, the latter. Our times together were brief, a couple of weeks in the summer, over 10 years. That was the only time we saw him. They were fun times. We were doing canoeing and all the things you do in the summertime. He loved to chop wood, so we'd be sawing and chopping wood. Over the years that we were growing up, he just never could open up and really discuss with us what had happened to him, what he thought had happened to him, why he'd acted the way he had with respect to our families. So it was a blank wall, except for this very friendly, charismatic father. And then at a certain stage, my brother and I are doing other things. We stopped seeing him in the summer. And really our relationship then was at a distance, as it had always been, and only by letters. And I only saw him 3 times from the age of 15 until his death.
How tragic is that for you?
My father was a hero. I grew up knowing that. My mother always told us the marvelous things he'd done during the war. She never said a cruel or angry thing about him. So I was able always to create the father I wanted as I grew up. Later, it was difficult, and as a young man, I did try to bring some of this to the surface. And really, he was helpless. He was emotional. He wept, but he couldn't really come up with answers to the big questions that a son would have. Only at the very end, when he was very ill after getting encephalitis and being ill for 4 or 5 years, that seemed to change his persona. And the last time I saw him, he was more open with me and wishing to tell me more than I'd ever seen him. So it was a very happy last meeting.
Glad to hear that. Jonathan, this is one heck of a book. The Captain Was a Doctor, The Long War and Uneasy Peace of POW John Reed. It has brought Jonathan Reed, his son, to our virtual studio tonight from Riverdale in downtown Toronto. We thank you very much for telling us your dad's story on TVO tonight and wish you well going forward.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's been a pleasure.
Tomorrow on the agenda.
For me, music was a way to mark time as we went through this year. You know, I remember January because I remember the Olivia Rodrigo album, and I remember August because I remember the really messy Kanye West rollout. Like for me, you know, because we're not really making a lot of new memories during this pandemic, the memories that I do have tend to be pop culture moments, and they tend to be music moments particularly, you know, like when a certain album entered my life or when a certain, you know, musician did something publicly that was really interesting to me.
That's tomorrow on the agenda. And that is the agenda for Monday, December 13th, 2021. Hard to believe it, but the iPod turned 20 this year. Tomorrow, we'll reflect on how it changed our music listening habits. Also, we'll consider the role of music in helping people get by during this COVID-era isolation. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.